Welcome to VBA Modeling for Supply Chain Planning and Financial Analysis. Here we will teach you how to write your own VBA code within Excel. This will be presented to you by Supply Chain Systems of Miami, Florida. Please contact us if you would like us to build models for you, or if you'd like to learn more about building the models for yourself. I hope you enjoy the tutorials, and please follow the link in the video description to get your own copy of the VBA code that is presented here. This first video will just be about setting up the program so that you can actually start developing and using the Visual Basic feature. It's kind of hidden away within the program, and you have to enable a couple things before you can get started. So on the first sheet of the download program, which is available on the Supply Chain Systems website, there's an explanation of how to turn on some of these features. The thing that you have to recognize is that there's different versions of Excel out there, and how you get at some of these options to turn on the features depends on the version that you're using. In this particular version, I'm using Excel 2010, but on the first tab of the worksheet it explains how to get to the same feature options within Excel 2003, 2007, 10, and 13. In this particular one, you first go up to the tab that says File. You click on the Options, which is down over here. And the first thing we're going to do is go down to Customize the ribbon and ensure that the check marks next to Developer is turned on. Click OK. So what you basically have done is made an extra tab up here on the above the ribbon available for you to be able to access. The second one is go back and do the same thing. Excel, Options. This time you're going to turn on a security feature to enable macros to be used within the system. So go to Trust Center Settings, and then go to Macro Settings and select the radio button that says Enable All Macros. Then click OK. Click OK one more time, and now you should be all set. And what you should see is that you have a Developer tab. Click on that. And if you were to go to the Visual Basic icon and click on it, you should see this kind of a panel popping up. And if you click on Module 1 on this particular demo program, you'll see this set of subroutines and macros already displayed. So we are going to go over all of these lessons during this series, starting with lesson number 1. Okay, that's the beginning of this tutorial, and I want to give you a couple concepts to round out this particular lesson before we really dive into all the different aspects of the Visual Basic. But now you should be able to run the macros and be able to display the ribbon option that says Developer. Alright, so the first thing that we have to recognize within Excel is that there's really two different types of addressing different cells within a spreadsheet. The first one is relative addressing, the other one is absolute addressing. A relative address is in a relationship to another point or location within the spreadsheet. Absolute addressing is where you actually explicitly want to refer to a very specific cell on a specific worksheet. That would be the most absolute case. Now there are variations within that, where you can vary between, you can have an absolute address on a row or an absolute address on a column, and the other one could actually be relative. And what would happen if you actually were to drag the corner of some part of a spreadsheet? What would happen there is that you would actually drag down whatever was in that spreadsheet, and if it had a formula in it, it would make it all relative if you were just to drag it down and try to copy all of the formulas. However, if you had a dollar sign like you see in this first concept lesson here, the dollar sign in front of either the column designation or the row designation would fix that particular address and say, we do not want to update the copying down through the cells and give it a relative address. The same thing's going to be true many times within your use within these macros, where you want to be able to either talk in terms of relative addressing or an absolute address. An absolute address might be you actually have a value for a particular supply chain dimension, and you want to keep that dimension all the time. Let's say it happens to be a safety stock value of 10%. You always want to have 10%, let's say, of the demand for that particular period. Well, that could be a fixed number and not calculated, and if it's always the same, you could give it a label and call it safety stock, and have it then be an absolute address that location on a particular spreadsheet is going to always have that value in it. And there you would not want to change the location. It would always be the same value on the same worksheet in the same cell location. Anyway, that's the concept of relative versus absolute addressing. Okay, the next one is the idea of Boolean logic. If you've been in any kind of a programming class, Boolean logic either has a value of 0 or 1. 0 would mean that it's false, a 1 value would mean that it's true. If you were to do any conditional So therefore, in a formula, you can actually have a calculation of real numbers where you're actually adding, subtracting, multiplying numbers together. But you can also do conditional testing where you'll have different parts of a formula will either be true or false. And then you can have operators between those, which would allow you to then create more of a dynamic conditional test where it can include multiple conditions, and you would have logical operators in between those conditions. And you have 3 different kinds of operators that can work within Boolean logic: an AND, an OR, or an XOR. AND is a condition where both of the tests have to be true in order for the final result to be true. An OR situation refers to either one is true or the other or both. The only condition that is completely false is when both of them are false. An XOR situation is when only one or the other is true. So you can't have a condition. So there's, out of 4 possible tests, you can only have a condition for that complete logic or result to be true would be when one is true and the other one is false, or vice versa. So that's typically the kinds of conditions that you have within Boolean logic. The logical operators within the logic can actually test numbers, test string values to see if it is exact match, and the kinds of operators that are used in those cases are under number 4 here, where you can have logic operators of less than, greater than, less than or equal to, greater than or equal to, not equal to, or exactly equal to each other. Those would be the multiple conditions that you could have within a logical test. . Another concept that you need to understand about Excel and VBA is the concept of scope. When you set up variables within a program, a macro or a subroutine, whatever you want to call it, you have that variable will retain its value throughout different parts of the spreadsheet, and you can look at this as layers of a tree. And if you want the most flexible type of result where this variable can hold its value throughout the entire program, you can actually set the variable so it's global in a sense of being available throughout the entire application. You could bring up multiple programs or multiple spreadsheets, workbooks, whatever, and you would still have that value maintained. Or you can limit the scope just within a single workbook. A workbook then also has multiple worksheets, but at the workbook level, that variable would retain its values through that entire workbook regardless of what sheet that you are on. Or you can go out to further down the tree and now you're looking at a worksheet, and that could actually be restricted to that particular worksheet. Similarly, within the macro domain, you can actually have different parts of the macros actually available too. So you have a project level, you have within the module, and there can be multiple modules within a project, or within an individual subroutine or macro within a module. A module can have multiple macros and subroutines or functions. So therefore, you can actually restrict those to a much lower level if you like. So the idea of scope is just a reference to making the variables more or less global on how they are actually used within the program. Many times you want them to be very restrictive right down to the local level. Let's just say you have a very common type of variable like N, like in Nancy, the letter N. Letter N could actually be used in multiple modules. So therefore you would not want to give it a global connotation. You would want it to reset every time it's used in another module. You would want it to reset every time it's used in another subroutine. So therefore, you would not designate it as a global scope. You would make it much more limited and a much more local scope within the program. For now, just be concerned with the idea that you can have things that are, it's almost like having a passport when you're traveling. You may be restricted in where you can travel to, and you are not allowed to travel to different countries unless you actually have visas to those specific countries. And you have to define that ahead of time before you go traveling or try to attempt to travel to those other countries. So that's the idea of scope. If I had a global passport, if there was such a thing, that means I could travel anywhere in the world and I would not need any visas, I would not need any extra papers in order to cross borders from one country to another. Similarly, within a program, when you define variables, you have to define ahead of time where they're going to be used and limit their use within those particular areas that you define initially within the program. I also want to, we introduced the concept of variables. What is a variable? A variable can represent a string of characters, it can represent numbers, or it can represent dates, and even objects, other things that you could find within programs, whether they be pictures or video clips or sound bites or whatever. These are all things that you could define within a program and define these as variables. You can also have a variable that refers to an object like a spreadsheet, a workbook, or a collection of cells. Could be an object all in itself, and you would have to define it as such. Okay, so when you define variables, you are also, besides the scope, going to define what type of a variable it is. Now, if you go back in time, very early days of programming, programming languages had to be set up so that they could be efficient and they minimized the amount of memory that they used. That is not as much a concern today, but you still, when you make a program too large and bloated, these programs run very slowly. And we always hate the idea of having to wait for a computer to finish its job. So you want to learn to be efficient and make sure that you define your variables properly so the programs will not have a problem when they run, and also so that it will run as fast as it can and not make your users wait, or yourself if you happen to be the only user of your program. Okay, so we'll get into this a little bit more, and I'll identify how we're actually defining the type of variables within a declaration. And some of the common words that you see on this particular one here, you see is either as a string, which is a collection of letters, words, etc. Another one is an integer, which has no decimal point, there's no fractions in it, it's just a whole number. You have single and double, where you can have numbers of different sizes, and if you were trying to be efficient about your space, you had a small number, you could define it as a single. If you wanted to have a larger number, which might be over 1 million, you could actually define it as a double, which would give you more space to hold a much larger number. Variance is a very interesting type of variable where you're not predefining exactly what kind of element is going to be stored into that variable. So variant is going to be the most wasteful of all the different kinds of variables that you might define, and you might have occasion where you need to use something like that, where there may be numbers in there, there may be letters or strings of characters, or even dates. So under some occasions you might need to define these things more flexibly, and you would define it as a variant. And finally, as a more of a common type that you will run into is dates and the handling of dates. And as you well know, you have dates also implies time, and time has different parts to it. You have days, months, you have hours, minutes, seconds, milliseconds, or fractions of seconds. So you're going to be defining exactly what part of a date and time that you are going to be using. Sometimes you just want to define a particular day of the year. Other times you might need to define things in terms of hours and minutes or even seconds. And so when you define a variable with a date, you are allocating that space to define it at these different levels that you deal with time and dates. The next one is to differentiate some words that we've already been using. We refer to variables, and I can see I have a misspelling here. I need to correct that very quickly. Okay. Constants and variables. Constants is a value within typically a variable type of a definition, but that will not change. You want to set it once in a program, and every time you use that name of that variable, it's going to imply the same value that you initially set it to. A variable really implies that you are going to be changing that value within that bucket, within that holder, that space, multiple times. It may be an iteration where you're going to be counting and you're storing the current count within a particular variable. It may be a calculated number. It may be something that you looked up on a table. You are going to store very many things into a variable name. Let's just say, for example, you're going to have a variable by the name of forecast. Well, is it going to be a forecast of a particular product, or a particular month of the year, or a particular year? You're going to name those variables, and it's going to represent some kind of a value that you're going to store in there, but it's going to apply, or imply, I should say, a certain type of value that you're going to use later on, and you're going to use it for comparison purposes, or it's going to guide you as far as generating as a driver certain activities within your supply chain. So variables is a very important concept and how you're going to use it, but you have to define it at different levels. It may be at a product level, it may be on a time basis, it may be on a geographic basis, it may be on a customer basis. You can see that you can have many different dimensions to the same variable that I might call as forecast. Okay, is it a forecast of what? Is it a forecast of a particular month, of a particular customer, of a particular crop, a geographic area? So you might have to actually define it much more discreetly in order to come up with a proper value that you recognize and make it useful. But I want to, at this point, just distinguish the idea between a constant and a variable. And constants, here again, to be a little repetitive, is a value that is going to remain constant throughout the program, hopefully. Okay, and variables will be subject to change depending on different conditions and how you want to load values into that particular location. Okay, I also want to just go a little bit further here. We're not going to define all of these concepts initially here, but the next one here is how we could actually concatenate fixed text and variables. I just want you to recognize that you can have a variable and you could put a string of characters or words within a variable, and then you can actually tack on to the end of that some additional characters either at the front or at the tail end. So you can say walk the dog. Well, at the very beginning that could be a constant, walk the dog, but now who walks the dog may be a variable. And in the variable, John walks the dog, Mary walks the dog, or Jane walks the dog. Okay, the variable for name could be put at the beginning, and then there are operators that are used to combine that fixed text with a variable and actually concatenate these two things together to build up a string. So I want you to recognize that you can actually you can have straight text strings that you could use and make a calculation with it. But the calculation is really not like math, but it's the idea of putting together different pieces of strings, either as a fixed string or as a variable that you pulled in from somewhere else, and then you put these things together and you concatenate them to make it into a complete sentence or a paragraph or whatever. The next one is the difference between formulas and operators. We talked about this a little bit earlier when we talked about logical operators, but in math, as you well know, anybody who's had math, you're going to be doing adding, subtracting, square roots. You can actually put things within parentheses or brackets, and you can have different parts of this operate in a priority way, so you control the math by how you structure the formula. And within these formulas, you're not just doing math. You can also have conditional logic within a formula that you're going to use a value from one place under one condition, and you're going to pull a value from a different place under a different condition. So let's say, for example, if I set a safety stock, it's a perfect illustration of this, that my value that I'm going to use in a calculation for supply-demand balance is that when I am below my safety stock, I am going to trigger production. If I'm above that, there is no need to trigger production. It would be excessive unless there were some other extraordinary reason for it. So I would test what the current inventory level is against the safety stock level, and I would either decide to go ahead and plan production, and I would calculate what that right production amount would be if I was below my safety stock. If I'm above my safety stock, the value for production for that particular period would be 0. I would not need to do that. So I can build up a formula that can actually calculate what the safety stock is under one condition, and I can also determine what my production amount is under a similar condition. So there are multiple situations where you will either calculate safety stocks and or calculate production requirements, and there are many other things that you're going to calculate in a supply-demand balance. I'm just giving you a couple examples of that. Okay, I think that's enough to start off with for this particular lesson, and I hope that this is a good basis for the other lessons coming up, and we'll introduce some more concepts to you that kind of bridge between supply chain optimization and VBA and Excel, and how you combine these two things together to make Excel a more useful tool. Thank you for joining me for today, and I hope you enjoyed this lesson.